All right, it's 9, so let's get started. Thanks everybody for coming. We're going to talk about conjuring data with APIs in PowerShell for the next 90 minutes. It should be fun. Let's hope. Who am I? I'm Stephen Valdinger. I'm the support manager at Chocolatey Software. You can find me everywhere at Stevie Coaster on all my social medias. Yeah, that's it. Let's go next. So what are we going to talk about, right? We're going to talk about what an API is, why APIs are useful. We're going to talk about invoke REST method, because that's kind of our pathway to using these things inside of PowerShell. We're going to look at Swagger/OpenAPI, since Swagger is now OpenAPI, means the same thing, and then we're going to put it all together. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll be able to look at any API you're going to be working with, understanding that Swagger, that OpenAPI document, and then understanding how to take the information that's there and turn it into useful PowerShell that you can then leverage in your own scripts and your own modules publicly within your company, whatever you need to do. Let's see if this thing works. We're going to try it. It's not going to work, of course. All right, so how many people are familiar with APIs? Yes. How many do APIs today in PowerShell? Excellent. Sweet. We're going to have a ton of fun. All right, so you guys already know that an API is an application programming interface then, hopefully. If not, that's what API stands for. It's a common interface that many languages can use to access the same thing. So you've got a server that's providing some sort of data, and there's an API with a schema running on that server. That means if you're writing PowerShell, you can talk to that API and get the same data back. If you're writing Python, same rules apply. C#, Rust, whatever the language is, all of those things can talk to an API. And the great thing about an API is it's got that schema behind it. So what you send it and what you get back is exactly the same, no matter what the language you're going to use it is. But the language itself looks different. Obviously, PowerShell code is PowerShell code, and C# is C#, et cetera, et cetera. So how you write it is different, but how you interact with it is exactly the same. So what is REST? REST APIs, that's the really, really, really common one. There's other ones that we're not going to mention because we're not going to mention them. But REST APIs are what we're going to talk about today. That's a representational state transfer. That's what that stands for. And there's a contract associated with REST that means you have to follow these rules in order for us to be able to call you a RESTful API. So those rules are, number one, it's got a uniform interface. That's the schema, typically that JSON document that OpenAPI/Swagger renders into a really easy to use web page for you that allows you to explore that API, understand all the methods, see what the data structures are for those different endpoints, et cetera, et cetera. It's got to have a client-server architecture, meaning there's a server running that exposes all of those methods and endpoints, and then a client that talks to that server endpoint to interact with the API. It's got to be stateless, meaning that when a client or your code sends a request to the API, everything within your code has to be complete for the API to complete the request. So if you're sending a post method with a bunch of data inside of the body, that body has to have everything in it that the server needs to process your request and give you a response back. If you don't, the server's not going to understand it, and you're going to get an error. And it's also got to be cacheable. Now, this one is a little interesting because servers can implement some server-side stuff to prevent caching from happening, but typically they don't, because in order to be called restless, you have to be cacheable. Typically, a service can be restful, but it's like a private API that's not exposed via the Swagger doc, so they can get away with, like, if you've ever seen DC equals and then a bunch of numbers in a URL, that's like a timestamp that says, hey, you can't cache this for this long or whatever in your browser. You'll probably never interact with an API that way when you're writing code for a publicly exposed API. Unless you're me and crazy, and we'll show you an example of how you can actually leverage a private API inside of a system if you really, really, really need to. So take note that REST API has to be cacheable. And all that really means is if you send a request to an API and part of that response is like a token or a certain data structure off of that response, you can use that data structure in another request to like a different endpoint of the same API, and the data will be valid. The server will say, okay, this is fine for a certain period of time, whether that's 5 minutes, 30 minutes, 3 days, whatever the server is configured for that cache limit, that's fine. And then once that expires, you have to send a request to request that data again so that you can send it to another request. That's really useful for things like OAuth, because when you're doing like a token, sometimes you'll like, hey, give me a token, and it'll give you a token back, and then you can use that token in other requests to other endpoints for a certain amount of time before you have to request another token. You have to tell the API who you are again. That way you don't have like a long-lived token living somewhere that's a security concern, right? So cacheable is very important with the REST API. It's got to be layered. I'm sorry, question?
Do the pagination links fall into that category?
Sometimes, yeah. Yeah, so the question was, do pagination links fall into that category? They can. It depends on who wrote the API and what they've done. I've seen it before. And then layered just means that each component can't interact with anything else. Like they're their own walled garden. Like a get method can't interact with a post method. They're different things for reasons. So why is this awesome, right? It allows that application's data, as I've stated, to be interacted upon by anything, right? C# can do it, PowerShell can do it, which is what we're going to do today. Any other language, it's different in how it looks writing the code, but the output's the same, right? Send a request, get a response. And why is it useful for us at this conference? It's because PowerShell is amazing and has this awesome engine behind it with this pipeline thing and this object-oriented system that allows you to do stuff like get foo, do something, and then send it somewhere else. So you can talk to an API over here to get some data out of this system and do something with it magically in PowerShell here, and then send it to another system over here if you need to. And you can do that all in a single line of code if you need to on the pipeline. PowerShell is amazing for APIs. I love it so much. And we're going to use the invoke REST method to do all the work. So you need a couple of things to do this right. You need to tell invoke REST method where to go. You need that URI. You need to tell it what the content type is, because depending on the method, the content type might be different. Now, 98.895% of the time, it's going to be content or application/JSON as the content type. But you might have other content types depending on what you're doing. If you're going to upload a file, for example, that content type is probably going to be multi-part form data, or it might be an image, or it might be plain text. But thankfully, when we look at a Swagger doc, the Swagger doc is going to tell you what the content type for the method is. So you'll have all the information at your fingertips. And again, we're going to use the method, what are we doing? And we're going to need a header, sorta. In Windows PowerShell 5.1, you're going to want to build a header that has like all your authentication, authorization stuff in it. In PowerShell 6 and higher, the web commandlets got a rewrite, and they got way better. They're so much better because you can just say, hey, my authentication is basic, and my credential is this PS credential object. You don't have to worry about building that header yourself. Those two things together will build the header for you on the fly, and you're done. So it gets way, way easier in PowerShell 7, PowerShell 6 and higher, whatever you want to say. And then we need a body, potentially. So if you're going to post data to something, you'll use a body most of the time. Again, I'm going to say most of the time because there's caveats to a lot of stuff with APIs, but it's really not that difficult. And thankfully, the Swagger doc is extremely helpful in letting you know when you need a body and when you don't. So let's talk about methods for a second. There's a few of them. A get method retrieves information about a resource, right? You send a request to a get thing. So maybe you've got an API endpoint that's about cars, right? So you say, hey, send me to this thing / cars and give me Fords, right? And the response back from that get endpoint might have Mustang and Shelby GT and F-150 and Lightning and all these different things, and then other properties about those things, right? It might have 4 doors or 2 doors or V8 or V6 or V4-wheel drive or whatever. Whatever that car endpoint does, you can get information about that stuff. Similarly, you can post data to an API to create a new resource in a system, right? So using the car thing again, maybe you're a dealership or something like that, and you get some new inventory, and you need to update your inventory. So you would do a post request that says, hey, this is a Ford Taurus. It's a 1997 with 180,000 miles on it, like whatever that needs to look like to post into your system. That's how you could send that request to that endpoint. Similarly, you can use a put to update a resource, but you have to be careful because a put method will actually create a resource if it doesn't exist. So if I've got one thing that's a Ford Mustang and it's blue and it's got big wheels on it and it's got a premium sound system and all this stuff on it, and then I come back and I realize that, oh, that car was red. It wasn't blue. So I make a put request to my API endpoint, and the only field I update is the color. What's going to happen to that record? I now have 2, well, do I? I have 2 records. One of them is just the color red with nothing else in it because I didn't put guardrails in. And the put method allowed me to do that because it creates a new record if it doesn't exist. The best way to update records is to use a patch method because typically an API, when you post something, it will like create a unique ID or something on that record as well. So the patch method will allow you to say, hey, this ID is 12345, and the color is now red. So it will patch that 12345 ID and just change the color. All the other properties will still be there and they'll be fine, but it'll do the right thing. So knowing when to use post, knowing when to use put, and knowing when to use patch is really important. And then, of course, there's a delete method. And hopefully that one is self-explanatory because it just deletes stuff. So a few examples in the wild. If you're not familiar with writing API wrapper module type stuff in PowerShell, I'm addicted to it, so I do it a lot. Here's a couple of things that I've done. Nexus Shell, it's a PowerShell API wrapper for Sonatype Nexus, which is a repository server, which is one that I work with all the time at Chocolatey. And it just gives me a nice CLI for like creating new repos or blob stores or managing those instances. Is a cool example of an API wrapper using open source status dashboard called Status, which hasn't been developed in forever, runs on Ruby on Rails, and Ruby is so far advanced from where the code is that it's impossible to get it to build unless you're a Ruby developer and really understand the ecosystem. So I wouldn't recommend playing with that one, like building a status server, unless you're good at Ruby. But the PowerShell code is cool to look at, so you can kind of understand what was in my head when I wrote that one. And then the PS Cloudsmith one is a PowerShell module for the Cloudsmith API that me and Adil Lagari, that is speaking somewhere over there right now, wrote together. So I hate slides, and that was like 9 too many for what I usually do. But there was a lot of information to cover. But we're gonna write some code. And the first thing we're gonna do to write some code is switch over to here. And I'm gonna log into this guy because it logged me out apparently. Oh, and learn how to type. This is gonna be a long 90 minutes, folks. And then we'll go into this one too, because why not? Oh, you know what? We'll come back to this in a second, as soon as I remember that I need to turn the VM on, that these are all running on. So bear with me while I boot that, and we'll actually write some code. How's that sound? All right, so let's talk about some theory for a second. And let's dive into authentication. Now, I said that authentication got easier in PowerShell 6 and higher, because it did. The PowerShell command line's got to rewrite for that stuff. This is what it looks like in Windows PowerShell 5.1. So if you've got 5.1 in your environments and you're kind of stuck with it for reasons, happens all the time. It's fine. It's just a little bit more work to build those headers. So all a header is a hash table. So that's what I've done here. So I've got this hash table, and for a basic authentication, which is a username and a password, like an email address and a password, or a username and a password, typically that's base 64 encoded when it goes into the header, and then the API accepts that as a base 64 encoded string. How do you base 64 encode something in PowerShell that's a credential? Well, you have to do some magic here with this thing. I use a format string for this because it's a little easier to read. So basically all this says is, hey, for this 0 index item, replace it with my username, Stevie Coaster, and for this 1 index item, replace it with some complex password and throw a colon in between both of them to separate them. And then we do this nonsense here with this systemconvert.net class to convert it to a base 64 string. But the first thing we have to do is actually get the bytes of that cred pair to base 64 encode them. So I don't know about y'all, but my brain is Swiss cheese, and I don't remember how to do that off the top of my head without looking it up. So what I did, and this is just another example of showing it, like you can have a credential object and a parameter and then just do the same exact thing, but break the credential object apart. So credential.username for the username, and then get credential method with the password property to get the plain text password off of there, so you can base 64 encode it. But anyways, back to Swiss cheese. I wrote this function called new encoded credential that allows you to just pass a credential object in, and you can either say with or without this as a header switch. So what that looks like under the hood, we do that same base 64 string thing, but I never have to remember it now because all I have to do is pass it a basic or a PS credential object, and it will either just return that base 64 string or give me a header back if I say as header. So if I'm doing something with invoke REST method and it's on Windows PowerShell and I need that header, I can just say, hey, my header is, in parentheses, new encoded credential as header, and I'm done. It's a little bit simpler, at least for me, to do this stuff. Because again, trying to remember this over time is something I'm not going to bet on. It's not going to happen. So that's authentication in a nutshell. There's other types of authentication. There's token-based authentication, which you just change this word basic to bearer, and then put your token in there, and you're good to go. The web commandlets for invoke REST method in PowerShell 6 and 7, again, with those authentication parameters, you can say authentication bearer, and then there's a token parameter. It's like a different parameter set when you say it's a bearer token, and that's a secure string. So the first time you do it, you're going to paste your token into there, and you're going to run it, and it's going to complain at you because it's a secure string, and that's going to break the habit. After that, you're going to be like, oh, wait a second, I have to convert to secure string and then pass that in. And we're going to run a lot of code, so I'm not going to run a ton of code just yet. I see some faces like, why is he not running anything yet? We'll get there. It's 90 minutes, guys. We got time. So pagination, how does that work? Use PowerShell 7 because it's really, really easy. Dash follow rel link is the switch that you can use to tell invoke REST method that when an API response says there's a link in the response, to follow it. And how many times do you want me to follow it? 2, right? So if we were to look at the PowerShell issues, the GitHub repository for PowerShell, and look at the issues, if we follow the rel links twice, we get way more issues back in the response than if we were to just drop all of this stuff altogether. And this one I'll actually run because it's pretty quick and easy. So if we do this and then say run selection, see how it kind of jumped, and I'm sorry, this needs to go away. But you get a ton of data back. And it's like a ton of issues, but I only followed it twice, so I didn't get every single issue on the repository. I only got a subsection, but I got more than if I would have not followed the rel links. It would have gave me like 30 back and stopped. This gave me like 60. So pagination, I really, really recommend you use PowerShell 6 and 7 because it's just parameters. If it's Windows PowerShell, I actually don't even remember how to do pagination in Windows PowerShell. It's been so long. But there's Stack Overflow out the wazoo to figure it out. It's not that difficult, but you do have to write the code yourself, basically, to get that response and then look at the response and find the link and then follow that link again and collate the responses together until you don't get any links back in your response. But again, PowerShell 7 just does it for you. It's wonderful. So query strings, pretty simple concept. And I said that most of the time an API endpoint will accept a body, which is like a JSON blob, is what you send it, and then you get data back from the response. Some APIs tag everything onto the end of the endpoint, and that's called a query string. So in this example, we've got api.fabricam.com. It's v2 of the API, and we've got this widgets endpoint. And then we've got this question mark thing, which is appropriate. What the heck does this mean? That's the start of the query string. And then you start splitting things apart by ampersands. So we want to say the type is a dongle, the color is blue, and the price code is stupid expensive because this is a really cool dongle, right? So that's what a query string looks like. And we'll get into some design considerations around these two things later. But functionally, when you're designing the PowerShell code that you're going to write, it's just parameters. And how you pass it to the endpoint is the only thing that's different. Is it a body on invoke REST method, or is it just a different URI? That's functionally it. You're still going to define the parameters the exact same way. It just looks different, but it's not that difficult. It's really not that difficult. It's super fun. So let me see if these are happy again. So that looks good. Yeah, it's going to be one of those days. Oh, really? I swear that's right. You. Yes. It's also because I can't type. Or I just don't remember what I made the password, which is entirely possible. So we'll just use this one because it's the same thing, just different. And we'll make this a little bigger, and we'll flip over to this, and we'll slide down here, and we'll go to API, and then boom, we get this cool Swagger doc, right? Anybody seen this before? Probably a lot of people have seen this before. All right, cool. For the people that haven't, this is a Swagger doc. These are all the different endpoints that this API supports, and these are all the different methods that that particular endpoint has available to it. So for assets, you can use a get method to list all the assets, or, and check it out, this is where things start to get really cool and helpful, you can get a specific asset by its ID over here in the URL. So when you're designing your PowerShell, you could say, okay, I'm going to write a get nexus assets commandlet, and I'm going to accept an optional ID parameter. And if somebody gives me an ID, I'm going to change the URI and add the ID to the end of the URI, and I'll get just that ID. But if they don't give me an ID, I'm going to use the other endpoint and just give them everything back. So it really starts to help you design things in your head before you even start writing code. You can look at this and be starting to visualize what that code is going to look like. And it helps you to be really, really, really logical about it. And sometimes get methods can have more stuff that you can be really, really specific about. This one doesn't. This only has that ID. But some of these in here are a little more advanced. And we're going to really, really, really look hard at delete methods a little later. Because I want you guys to be successful with using a delete method and not treat it as an opportunity to test your backups. Because stuff can happen. And bad things happen when you use a delete method and you're not careful. But thankfully, again, PowerShell's awesome and has all these sweet guardrails built into it, right? With what if and confirm preference and all these things. So you can protect your end users when you're designing your code to help reduce the likelihood that you're going to test your backups, right? Will you prevent it 100% of the time? Probably not. But we'll get you some tools that'll help you be a little bit successful with preventing it as best you can. So let's look at the blob store API because it's got a lot of stuff to it, and there's a lot of goodness in here. So we've already talked about a get method a little bit and how you can kind of understand based on the Swagger doc what this code's going to look like already, right? For getting a blob store, I can already tell you that I'm just going to say get blob store and have no parameters, and it's going to give me every single blob store I have. Or what I'm going to do is maybe have some parameter sets that say, okay, get me all the blob stores of this type, and then based on that, do something else. Or I could say, give me all the S3 blob stores that start with this name, et cetera, et cetera. And you can really start to see where you can hone in which API endpoint you're using, but you're only writing like one function. You're making that function do everything for you that's useful to your end users that has to do with the method. So here's like 5 or 6 get methods, but using parameter sets in your PowerShell code, you can have one function that still does one thing and one thing well. It just is more flexible. You don't have to have like a separate function for getting all the file-based blob stores and a function for getting all the S3-based blob stores, right? That's bad UX. Think about the UX of the thing while you're reading the Swagger doc, because if it's hard to use, nobody's going to use it. It's just facts. That's how it is. If you make it really easy for your users, they're probably going to want to use it and be successful with it. So let's look at this post method for a second as well. So if we look at a post method, you can see that it gets a little bit more complicated. And this is the body. This is the object that is defined by the schema, right? And if we click over here to the model, it gets a little crazy, but it's really, really helpful. So if I'm going to create a new file-based blob store, based on what I see here, I know that I can give it a quota, and that parameter should be a string because the type on the schema is a string. And oh, when I'm writing my comment-based help, because we're writing comment-based help for this stuff, because we are, that's pretty good to define the parameter. That's exactly what's in the schema. That helps tell the end user that, oh, this parameter is how much quota we have, right? You can expand it a little bit if you want to, but you don't have to. And for a soft quota, I see that not only does it have a type, but it has a limit as well. So this is going to look kind of weird when I go to write the code. What is this going to look like? Well, if we look at this, and this is where Stevie starts to be like, I've got 90 minutes, let's have some crazy fun. Let's just write it. So if I were to design this, let's see, new Nexus blob store, right? We're going to create this function, and we're going to give ourselves some free guardrails because, again, PowerShell is awesome. So we're going to let what if and all that good stuff come along for the ride. And then we're going to start defining some parameters, right? So the first one that I saw was optional because it's not marked as required. I know it's a string. And I know it should probably be something like soft quota, right? And then maybe I want to do, what else? Let's do a limit, and let's see what a limit actually is. So space remaining quota and space used quota. Actually, this has an enum on the type. Yes, this has an enum on the type. So this could either be a space remaining quota or a space used quota. So let's do that. So let's do a validate set that says this can be a space remaining, or what was the other one? Space used. So I just gave myself guardrails that somebody can't use an invalid quota type for this, right? If they give me anything else, PowerShell is going to stop me before any of my code runs because I've done it in the parameter block. And the next thing we're going to need is this to come up here. And then, let me see, we need a parameter again, and we need a limit. But what is it? This is a limit in megabytes. So we could do an int, what is it? An int 64 even, fancy. So we can say limit in megabytes. And we don't actually have to do the math. This is fine. If we say 10, it's 10. The API does the math for us. Sometimes that's not the case, but the Swagger doc is super helpful because it'll tell you. So if you need to like convert it to bytes or whatever, do the math in the PowerShell, but let the Swagger doc tell you what to do. So this is cool. I now have a soft quota, I have my type, and it's locked down to the only things that the API accepts, and then I have my limit, which is optional. That's pretty handy, but let's do this. Let's say parameter set name equals quota, and then let's make this mandatory, and then let's make this a member of the same parameter set, but make it optional because it is. Set name equals quota, right? So we have that. Very good. What else do we need to make this blob? We need a path, which is the path to the blob store contents. That'll be like the absolute path on disk. So what this will be is parameter. We're going to make this mandatory because it doesn't make sense to create a file blob store and point it absolutely nowhere. So we are going to say string, and we are going to give it a path, and then we are going to put guardrails on it. So we are going to say validate script, and inside of here we'll say something like test path that, and this may or may not work. I'm flying by the seat of my pants up here, guys. So path, that's fine. And then what else do we need? We need to tell it what's the name, and this will be like friendly name. So what we can say is parameter, and we'll make this one mandatory because, again, don't create a blob without a name because what the heck is it, right? So string, and then we'll say name. That sounds pretty good. That looks good. All right. And then we just have to fill in the pieces. And one thing I'm going to do, since I'm using parameter sets here, I'm going to say default parameter set name equals just make something up default.
You need a $sign for your software.
Thank you. I saw the squiggly just as you said that. Awesome. That looks good. Parameter mandatory. What did I do? Where is the thank you? We'll just put this there. And then we'll move this here, and then we'll put one at the end. Actually, I hate that. Okay, thank you. All right, so what else do we need? I think that is it. So what we need is the actual URL. So let me grab v1 blob stores file. Okay. So what I like to do is do something like this and say like v1 blob store, and then file, and then base URL equals, what is this going to be? HTTPS dev 8443 plus the slug. That looks good. And then set my URI. So URI equals, actually, no, that sucks. Let's do this. I do. Thank you. Oops. Beautiful. All right. So that looks good. Now let's start building parameters. Is anybody not familiar with splatting? Does everybody know what splatting is? Okay, cool. So we're going to splat stuff. So IRM splat. And we're going to do this hash table thing. And then we're going to start adding all the pieces and parts that invoke rest method needs. So our URI is going to equal our URI. And then we're going to need a header is equal to, and then we'll fill in a header in a second. And then we need a body. And actually, we'll say body equals body like this. Say like this, body convert to JSON. And this is a post method with a content type equal to application JSON. And then after we're done, we can say invoke rest method at IRM splat. And we're done. So let's build this header real quick. So it's going to be authorization equals basic. And then let's do this. Let's go rob Peter to pay Paul. Give me you. Thank you. Come over here. Run selection. Thank you very much. New. Go to credential. We'll do that. And then and go. That was dumb. Actually, this is all I need. It's good enough. Over here. All right. So at this point, we've got a new next blob store function that may or may not work. Let's find out. So we can run selection. Maybe. Pretty please? Really? Pretty please. Pretty please. Thank you. There we go. Just make sure that went down there. It did. Okay, cool. So now we should be able to say new nexus blob store, and then we start getting all of our parameters, right? So we can give it a name. Let's call this, what do we want to call it? Summit 2023, because I'm clever. Path is going to be, let's just do ctemp, because that sounds like fun. And then optionally, let's say a soft quota, and then we can do only two things. So we can say space remaining, and then, what was the other one? Limit in megabytes. Let's do like 300, right? And then, with any luck, yes, test. Okay, my validation script is wrong. It's fine. Test with a. Actually, you know what? Who cares? It's just a demo. All right. Let's see if this runs now. Maybe, please. All right, cool. So if we look, HTTP method post is not supported by this URL.
You grabbed the Git.
I did grab the Git, did I? No, that's post blob stores file. What is it? HTTP.
Oh, blob store.
It's fine. I can't type. I can't read. I'm just having all kinds of fun up here. It's all good. All right. One more time. For kicks and giggles, right? Let's see. That actually. Post is not supported by this URL. Why not? Why not? Application JSON. That looks right. See, this is why I write code live, because it's fun to see red text, right? 4 or 5 digits admin.
Soft quote is a structured. You're typing your limits.
You were right, I didn't handle that. Oh, and you know what? It's funny story. Where's my body, folks? So body equals, let's make this a hash table. So, and this is how I like to do this. Let's build this kind of dynamically. So we'll create an empty hash table, and then we'll say body dot add, and then we definitely have a path with a path. So that gets added, and then body dot add. What else was it? The name, and that was name. So that's fine, and then we can start dealing with the optional stuff. So we can say if soft quota. We can say body dot add. What was that? So that's going to be soft quota, and we will say soft quota, and that's a lowercase s. It gets picky, so if it's cased a certain way, case it a certain way. And then in this, we can add another hash table, and this will be the type is equal to, and that is lowercase, type is equal to soft quota. I think that's what it is, yep. And then the limit is equal to the limit in megabytes, like that. So now, with any luck, this should run. At least I'm hoping it runs. Let's see. Probably not. Did it die? It died again. Why are you dying? Now I have a body.
I don't know if this is the reason, but your validate set values for soft quota are missing the word quota at the end of them.
Nah. Guess what? That's what it is. Actually, no, it should throw an error. Well, depending on the API, I might be getting a weird error that's just not correct. So you might be right. So space remaining. Let's see. Actually, no. Let's look at the model. Let's look at the model because this is being weird. Okay, quota type string. Enum space remaining quota. Yeah. Space remaining quota. Space used. Quota. That's fine. Now I'm going to make it work. We're stuck here until it works, folks. Soft quota argument. Yeah. Yeah, it's just this. That needs to be that. It's still broken. It's still 405. I'm about ready to just say heck with it. You get the point. That's how you do it. This is what it looks like.
When you convert to JSON, you can specify that.
Oh,
Your soft quota needs a comma, right? No. JSON?
no, this is fine.
No, you have a question. Is it supposed to take a post, or is it supposed to be a put?
You have lowercase body and
Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, it's a post method.
It's not supposed to be.
Yeah, it's a post method. I'm wondering,
slash for the V1.
you know what? Hold on. I bet you. Header equals, let me see if it's just my header causing a problem. Let's see. Invoke rest method.
It's a village.
Yeah, hold on. That's fine. Headers equals that. No, that would have filled in automatically. That's fine. You know what? This is literally a demo VM, so I don't care if we do.
25 needs a dollar sign, doesn't
let me see. 25. Yeah, it does. So that is that, and that is that, and let's do this. One more Hail Mary approach here. So we will say, we'll just do it this way. Parameter, we'll make it mandatory. And this will be a PS credential. And we'll just call this credential, because that's what I called it, right? Yeah, okay. So encoded creds, and then this can be authorization equals basic encoded creds. That looks good. And run selection. No, format. That's what I want, because I'm not done with this yet. And this can be my header. And then let's do this and run selection. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So it's just literally broken. I'm wondering if it's something weird with I'm on my Mac, but not, it's like not going through the NAT properly or something, because that should work. Yeah, it's HTTP method post is not supported by this URL. That's got to be it. It almost has to be it. Wait. Oh, hold on. No, there it is. There it is. So /service/rest. See, read the entire Swagger doc before you start.
It's still there when you go back to it.
Yeah, that's fine. So now let's clear this. And auth. And what is it? Yeah, path is required. So path, body, path is required. Is that not in the right place? Where'd my blob store endpoint go? There it is. Okay, blob store path. I'm trying to. Yes. Forever, my shame is on the internet, right? Hey, it worked. Yay. All right, yes. Now, hold your applause, because I'm going to check and make sure I actually have a new blob store. Let's see. Hey, there it is. All right, yeah. It did work. So there, from start to finish, there's a Swagger doc for you. Now that I went off on a tangent, what else was I going to talk about? Yeah, I think so. You kind of saw how the sausage was made. So all these methods are just different examples of doing puts, right? So here's kind of understanding a put method, where you've got a body and you do some stuff and then you post it using invoke REST method, and then you make it a tool, right? So here's a function, here's a whole bunch of parameters, but you do the same thing. Like, here's a whole bunch of if statements that if you give me a certain parameter, I'm going to build the body dynamically as we go. And then once I have my body, it's literally invoke REST method. So it's really simple to, take something from a Swagger doc and turn it into something useful. All of these are pretty much the same. And I'm just going to check my time real quick. Okay, cool. Not bad. And we're going to spend a little bit of time on this one.
Can you quickly,
Mm-hmm.
what's the reason you use invoke REST method as opposed to web request? What are the...
So invoke REST method is specifically targeted to talk to REST endpoints and understand how they communicate. Invoke web request talks to a website. So you can use invoke web request to do things to a REST endpoint. But invoke REST method takes the response from the API endpoint and automatically creates a PS custom object of the response and gives it back. Whereas with invoke web request, it's going to give you a response, but you have to do something with it, and you have to build yourself whatever the structure is that you need. So yeah, invoke REST method is what you want. So yeah. So let's talk about deletes for a second. And let's talk about guardrails, right? So this is pretty dangerous if we've got a delete method and you just post something to it and do nothing to check it, right? It's gone. As long as it was a valid request, the data's gone. So that could have bad consequences. So what we can do is do something like this. So we give ourselves not really any guardrails at all. We just make a function. It looks good, right? So it is a tool, but it's not really safe. So let's spend some time making it a safe tool. So Kevin Marquette, if I don't know if he's in here or out there where he's at, but he's running around. He wrote a really cool blog post that is now on the docs for PowerShell about using a force parameter and confirm impact and what if and how you can really be effective with that stuff. This is what that looks like. So in your commandlet binding, you would put supports should process, and that allows you to do this thing here. So if should process is true, let's do a thing. That's how that works. And then confirm impact changes when PowerShell prompts you to say yes, no to all, whatever that is, right? So confirm impact is what is driving that. The default setting is medium, but I want it to be in your face. If you don't tell me to force it, I want you to confirm it. That way it just stops. Now, obviously, confirm and what if kind of come along for the same ride. So if you say dash what if, it's going to kind of do the same thing and give you the what if output. But if you do nothing at all with confirm impact saying set to high, what's going to happen is it's going to stop and it's going to say, hey, you're about to delete this thing from the system. Are you really sure you want to do that? And if you say yes, well, it's on you because you said yes. I tried to stop you, but yeah. So what does that look like once we get down here? That's in the commandlet binding, and then I add an optional parameter, a switch parameter called force. And what that does is if you say dash force, I shut off confirm impact because you told me to do it. You're like, hey, really do this forcefully. We'll do it, right? So what that looks like in practice is if we come down here, we start this branching logic that says, if you've given me force and not confirm, so if you haven't done like dash confirm colon false or true or whatever to kind of short circuit the behavior, but you've given me force, what I'm going to do is set the confirm preference to none in this block and then say, look at my should process block, right? So then I would say, hey, if it should process, I'm going to give this message, and then I'm going to delete the thing. Otherwise, I'm going to say, hey, do you really want to do this? This is going to happen, blah, 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 delete the thing. So by adding this force and not confirm thing, basically, we short circuit everything, and it just happens. Otherwise, we start to get those guardrails where it says, do you really want to do this? Because you could have a really long night if you do. I really like this feature because I've had the really long night because I didn't do this. It sucks. It really does. But PowerShell's super helpful with this type of stuff. So when you're doing delete method stuff, build guardrails. And it doesn't really specifically apply to deletes either, right? You might want to protect a post method the same way with the ability to make sure that you really want to send that data before you send the data, because adding data could have just as bad of consequences as deleting data. Like, bad data is worthless, right? So that's kind of what that looks like as well. Does anybody have any questions? Because I feel like I'm throwing a fire hydrant at you. So the question was, do you ever find convert to JSON to be weird? Paraphrasing. Yes, I do. Not really with the compress thing. I haven't really seen an instance where I've had to add compress and it make a difference. The default depth to convert to JSON, I think, is 3. So for bigger API endpoints that have a really complex model behind them, where you've got a bunch of nesting and you've got this hash table full of hash tables full of hash tables, and it just kind of cascades, pay attention to how deep your hash tables go and set your depth to that. Or if you want to, set your depth to something crazy like 100 just by default. That way you don't really have to worry about it. Just set it once and forget it. That way the JSON is actually in the correct format when it goes up. Because otherwise, if you just leave the depth at 3, parts of your payload are going to fall off. They're not going to be converted to JSON. They're just not going to exist in the object. And you will chase your tail trying to figure out why your endpoint's returning an error until you realize the errors of your ways. And I'm going to throw something at you because that was a good question. And who else asked? Here, I forgot about this. Here, you asked a question. Oh, look at that here.
Floor chocolate.
Yeah, floor chocolate. Here, Judd, can you catch this and then make sure it gets back there? Good, good. So yeah, I come with treats, so ask good questions. All right, anything else?
I don't have a question, just a comment. Sure. So, like, we've had to deal with several different APIs in our environment, and like what I use to build the stuff, like what you're building, is Postman. And so we import that stuff, and then like you can pick any language that you want to actually build your connection, and then test out all that stuff, and then make your functions after that. But it simplifies a lot of this troubleshooting because you can do it all within the app, and it gives you all your parameters, and you actually build all your environments per application.
Yeah, this guy. This is Postman.
No, it is PowerShell. It's PowerShell, whatever language that you want. It actually spits it out,
Yeah.
and then you can just copy and paste it over into a function, and then use it.
There's also a great repo that's curl GPS, so grab
Yes.
all your Postman collections and just deposit them.
Yeah. And so, like, yeah, I don't have the headspace to set your troubleshooter off, but if I throw it over to Postman, it makes it really user.
Yeah, and the nice thing about these collections is they're exportable. So if you do a bunch of stuff and you want to give it to another guy to keep working on it or add to, you can export your collection and send it off. We actually use collections at Chocolatey for our central management API development. Put a bunch of stuff together that I go and steal every once in a while because I'm trying to play with something.
The Swagger files in the API specification, which is what Swagger is for, or other way around. They have some tools where you can just point it at a Swagger file and it'll generate a client for whatever language. It's a very standardized client. So Go, C#, Python, PowerShell.
Yeah.
Like they automate.
Automate is
tools. Yeah, it's common. Yeah. So it varies. There's options.
Yeah, I have a love-hate relationship with that stuff just because I like having control over naming things myself. If you like auto-generate stuff, you end up with things that look like the graph module, where your commandlets are like this long, or your parameters don't make sense. Yeah, exactly. It's like, here's the schema, and I'm just going to verbatim name stuff or make it up as I go. And typically with like the auto-rest stuff, it gives you a compiled module back, which is C#. So that can be really jarring as a PowerShell developer. Like, you're not super familiar with C#, you can get by. Like, I'm not a C# developer, I'm not very good at it. Can I read it? Yeah, I can. But if I need to fix something, it's going to take me a while. Or I'm going to bother somebody at work and be like, hey, I don't get this, can you help me? And that takes them away from doing whatever they were doing. So I tend to try and just follow the schemas myself and write it myself, because I'm a control freak like that. And it allows me to be a control freak like that, and have really good UX. Because
you end up with binary or Boolean parameters that most
Yeah.
of us would rather see as switch parameters.
Exactly. Yeah. Speaking of UX, we've done a lot of looking at code, et cetera, and I cannot tell you how important it is to open VS Code and put a blank space and hit pound and just fill the thing in, because it almost writes it for you guys. Please do comment-based help. This stuff, like giving instructions to your users in the shell so they don't have to leave the shell, is awesome. Please do it. And there's other tools available like Plaid APS that will take this comment-based help and turn it into Markdown, so you can have online versions of your help as well. So if somebody's using your stuff and they need help, they can say get help thingy -online, and it opens up over here, and it's not in their way over here where they're working. So they can keep plugging away and trying to poke things over here, but have the help over here. Like, it's so simple. It really, really is so simple. Think about the UX of the thing when you're designing this stuff. Think about the parameter names. Use the schema to help you name things. Change the parameter name if you need to. Like, this might not make sense. Like, having it called soft quota, that might not make sense. Maybe you just want it to be quota, or maybe you want it to be quota type instead, because that's more clear what that is to the end user, right? And then you've still got this way to say, okay, it's a quota type, but the schema dictates that I need to either say this or this. So you can still put your guardrails in, you can still do your validate sets, you can still do your validate scripts, you can still let PowerShell be PowerShell and help you out. But when you deliver it to your end user, they're going to want to use it because it works so well, because you spent some time thinking about it up front and really paying attention to what you're doing. I cannot stress enough how important the UX of the thing is over the thing actually doing what it's supposed to. Like, to me, when I write stuff like this, the thing actually working is secondary. The first thing I think about is, how is this going to work for the end user? Is this too hard? Because it doesn't have to be. It really doesn't have to be. There's so much cool stuff that you can do with PowerShell in this thing that it just makes sense to lean into the language, to let it help you.
The quota type is a great opportunity to use friendlier terms.
It is.
And just map those to the API's terms.
Yeah, you absolutely could. Maybe these don't make sense in your head, right? And you take this and make it more friendly, and then you just do a hash table where this becomes the key, and the actual value that the API wants is the value, right? So you just key pair it.
You can put a help message in so people can.
Yeah, absolutely. It makes a ton of sense. Let's talk about testing them for a second, because I feel like I would be doing y'all a disservice if I didn't talk about testing an API endpoint. We did, live. But let's do it for real with Pester, okay? Although this is a whole nother level of trauma, but it's fine. So what does this look like, right? So this is a really simple Pester test that I did not write because I did not know what I was doing when I first started thinking about this. But thankfully, I work with people that do. So this was written by James, which he might be in here, I don't know. But this is what it looks like. So I've got a test that I want to test this update Nexus file blob store commandlet, right? So what I do is basically scope it to my Nexus shell module, and then I start giving it fake stuff. So inside of this module, I use a script scoped header across everything. So there's a connect function that generates that header that you run first, and then that header gets reused for every other commandlet in the module. So you only have to like connect once and then you're good, sort of thing. So we fake it, right? The invoke REST method call expects there to be a header parameter. It's mandatory, so we have to give it one. So we just lie. That's all testing invoke REST method with Pester is. We're just lying to get something back to make sure it actually works. So we lie about our header, and then we say we're going to fake this invoke Nexus call in the Nexus shell module scope, within the scope of this test, right? And then we start to actually mock our functions. So we're going to mock this get Nexus blob store function, which is a real function in the module. We actually do want to call for real this function, but we want to use fake data under the hood, right? So this is actually going to use invoke Nexus under the hood, and it's going to give us back an object of some form when we run it. So what we do is, if we have a blob store object, we do that. Otherwise, we give back this object, which is fake data, but it's a real object. So to the test, everything worked as expected because we got an object back. So what we can do here, if we look at updating a blob store from default, we do this call that says, I for real want to run update Nexus file blob store with these parameters. And then for our actual test, we want to assert that this function used our fake invoke Nexus to do the work. And then we just give this fake function some fake data that it can use, and then it uses it, and we get a passing test, right? So mocks are kind of difficult to wrap your head around, and I'm still wrapping my head around them a little bit, but it's all about lying to the thing, honestly. You just lie with data and hope that the test passed, that you lied good enough, I guess. I don't know. But that's what it's all about. Testing invoke REST method stuff, you just have to short circuit the parameters with fake stuff to get the right responses back. I will kindly ask you to talk to like somebody else that does a whole lot of Pester testing with this stuff to get like super into the weeds of it, because I've told you about everything I know about it. I don't do this very much. I do want to get better at it and add more tests to all my stuff, and this is a start. So I am going to get better at it, but just starting to scratch the surface with that stuff. But it's really cool.
With software, you just get to match the interface, so whatever it needs to come in and whatever it needs to respond, you have to match. So
Yep,
when you're
exactly.
API testing, look at the Swagger.
Yep.
It says it takes these parameters and it returns this thing. That's what you have to match.
Yep. Exactly. You just got to lie with confidence.
Like ChatGPT.
Exactly. Exactly. Was there anything else that I needed to talk about? Let's do a query string one real quick just to show that, because we did a body one. Let's look at the Swagger doc and see if there's a query string one that's interesting. So, none of these are really good. None of these are really good. Let's just fake one. I like writing code. We'll write more code. What's my time? Do I have enough time? Yeah, I got 5 minutes. So let's do this. PowerShell. Function. Fake. Query string. So what is this going to look like? So let's build our commandlet binding stuff. Oops. Another type param. And then let's just add some data, right? So parameter, this one's going to be mandatory. It's going to be a string. It's going to be a make. And we're going to have a parameter that's also mandatory. And we'll just do a model for this one. So string and a model. And then, oops, not mode, model. And then let's do parameter. Mandatory. And let's do int. And call this year, right? So for this, the only difference between doing a body and a query string for the API is literally the URI. So if we say like URI equals HTTPS, actually let's do it like this, HTTPS API.fabricam.com / maybe it's v2 because why not? New car, let's do a query string, and then we can say make equals, and then we just plug in our parameters, right? Make is our make, model is equal to our model, and then the year is equal to our year, right? So that's literally the only difference, and then you can go invoke REST method, URI method, post, and for our purposes, we'll say that's good enough, right? So the only difference between a body and a query string is a query string, you just kind of hang all your parameters off the end. Otherwise, you're creating a hash table for your body. So otherwise, it would be body equals something like this. Make equals make, model equals model, and year equals year. So this is query strings. This is bodies in JSON. And then it's invoke REST method after that. Everything else is the same. Does anybody else have questions or anything like that? Because I'm running short on time.
How do you typically handle like return output? Like usually developers return JSON that's just gross, like underscores.
So how do you handle returned output? That is a great question. Let me do this because the answer is it depends. So if you look at this one, for example, if we do blob store and we say get nexus blob store.ps1, and we scroll all the way to the bottom, what we do is we invoke nexus and we get some data back, right? So I'm not really doing anything here. I'm relying on just invoke REST method to give me the response back. It's going to be the correct data. It's going to be a PS custom object. It's going to be fine. Other times, what you get is like a response that has a results property, and all the stuff you really care about is in that results property. So in cases like that, what you would want to do, so maybe let's pretend this returns a weird response, right? So I will say response equals invoke REST method, do all my stuff, and let's clean this up and like fake it a little bit, so IRM primes, just so it's a little cleaner. Then I can start to do something with this because all my data is going to be in that response variable, right? So if I wanted to be lazy and just find the results, I could literally say response.result, and I'm done. Or if I wanted to be a little bit picky, like maybe the API, the response has a whole ton of crap on it, and I don't need all of that stuff by default. Maybe I give them an option to get it all, and maybe I don't. So in that case, what you could do, and actually this is going to bother me. Okay, there we go. So what you could do there is literally just create a PS custom object of your own. Yes, it is. Whatever. You know what? This has been a train wreck. It's fine. It's fine. So then we can do like whatever we want in here, right? So maybe we have like, I don't know, foo equals response.result.foo, right? And we just cherry pick the properties off the object that we want and return that by default. Otherwise, you could come up here and maybe and like I did with that Nexus shell example, I might say parameter switch detailed, right? Or full or whatever you want to name it, and then base my response here on that. So if I do detailed, give me, that was stupid. Do this. I mean, it's still spelled wrong, but whatever. Else. Wait, is Josh King in the room? Yeah, he is. Dang, I'll also do it this way. Cuddled him. That's right. Like a teddy bear. So we can either say, hey, if you gave me detailed, I'm just going to spit the whole object out at you, and it's up to you to filter it. Or create my own and cherry pick. So again, it's PowerShell. It's super flexible. It's awesome. It gives you all this stuff for free, basically. You just have to think about it. So that's more of a design decision than anything else.
And sometimes when I do that, usually I'll create like a class for each one of these objects when they come out, and then just
This is coming at you. Actually, Judd, can you like be the middleman again? All right. Anybody else? What's up?
So does invoke res method return an object, or does it return JSON?
It returns an object. Yes, it returns a PS custom object. Yes. And hopefully your API is not crazy or weird, and you have to do some stuff to the object to make it useful. Like, it's a PS custom object, but depending on the API, they can still be pretty friggin' ugly, and you want to massage it a little bit and clean it up. But yeah, it's an object. We didn't really talk about like catching errors and things like that. You can. Yeah, you can. Oh yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Look at that. Thanks for keeping me honest. So you can like wrap this stuff in try catch, right? So try, if it works, catch, throw a custom error if you want to. I tend to not and just let invoke res method throw the error back at me, because if I did something wrong, the API is going to spit something at me, and I'll just handle it from there, because 9 times out of 10, it's the wrong data or something. So I don't really do a ton of like try catch stuff with invoke res method. It's pretty good on its own with being helpful. We got a question somewhere? What?
I've got a question for the room.
Okay, what's up?
We touched on testing, and Stephen was like, yeah, I'm no good at this. I had someone else do it. If Summit offered a 200 or even a 100 tester session, who would attend?
I'd do it.
I'm not the guy to put it on.
wow.
But there's gotta be somebody.
Yeah.
One thing to be aware of with query strings is they have to be HTML encoded. So sometimes if you have weird characters,
They do.
it has to have a different encoding than the body.
Yeah.
So
They do. So you can do that.
Spaces, %20, like stuff like
Yeah.
that. Just
You
something to be aware of.
yeah,
Or
you can do like system.uri
Yeah,
and then like what is it? Dot
It's like URL.
encoding and then yeah, you can encode it that way.
It's just something you have to.
Yeah, there's a .NET class that makes it really simple, but just pass your URI to that and then send that to the endpoint. Yeah, good catch. Yep. So, anything else? Because I am pretty much at time, almost. Yeah.
Quick question. It looks like most of the stuff you're doing manually, but if you do any like automated, like we use automated stuff, or just have it set to do it a certain time every day. How do you handle like logging? So like we'll do pulling hundreds of users' data.
Sure.
Directory. So like, do you just pipe everything out to a log file, or have you found a better method or anything like that?
I mean, PowerShell's got a ton of stuff built into it that's really, really good. Outputting to a file is fine. You can literally throw start transcript at the top of your scripts and just write a transcript file, and the output from the thing will be in the transcript, so you get all the logging from the session inside of there. That's a really good way to do it. You could send it to a CSV file and drop it somewhere if you want to do it that way. If it's Windows systems, there's this really cool thing called the event viewer that you could write like a custom source, and you don't like have to write a custom source. You can just name stuff whatever you want and have that custom thing show up in like the application log of event viewer, and then put your PowerShell output in that message. And you can either do like different types, right? You could have an informational message with good output if you want to do it that way. If something had a problem, you could throw a error message into the log, whatever. And then you've got other tools available to you that can take that event log data and do something with it. Like you can forward it to a collector, you can send it to Splunk or Datadog or whatever. There's a ton of options. So there's not like a one-size-fits-all solution, like do what makes sense for you, right? And enjoy some chocolate. 'Cause I remember. Almost. Yeah.
Is there any caveats, like if I was running PowerShell like on a Linux system?
Are there any caveats to running PowerShell on a Linux system when it comes to writing? There's not. I'm on a Mac, and all of my stuff is written on a Mac to work on a Mac, which will work on a Windows system, which will work on a Linux system. There's not any worries about it. Yeah, it just works. Yeah.
In the info about the session, there was a comment about writing your own API endpoints that other systems can run.
Yeah, there's no time. But check out Adam Driscoll's PowerShell Universal. It's amazing. The endpoints section in there, you can write all the API endpoints you want for free in his thing. And the cool thing is it's just PowerShell. So you create a new endpoint, say what method you want to use, and then just write PowerShell code. And then when you write invoke REST method calls against that endpoint, it's just sending that data to that PowerShell script on the back end, basically, and then you get a response back. It's really, really, really slick. And if you pay Adam for PowerShell Universal, which you should, it will generate Swagger docs for you as well, which is really cool because if you do all this stuff and write all these APIs, then other people on your team can go to the Swagger doc and like write modules for it and stuff like that. It's really, really great. And here, have some chocolate. Almost. Oh, yes, he got it. Sweet. Anything else? Because I'm at time. So I'm at time, but I will take questions in the hallway because I will literally talk all day.